Our next presenter, Viki DuMez. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Viki DuMez.
Hey.
Nice to have you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Mary Blanche Head Wells Godfredson. Last month, the city of Kenosha had this big hoopla and celebration about my grandson, Georgie. You know him better as Orson Welles. So on this summer night, I thought we should talk about somebody much more interesting. Me. My father, Orson Sherman Head, the formidable district attorney, state senator, notary public, and all-around blowhard, and my mother, Mary Jane Treadwell, were married in 1846 in Kenosha. A year later, in 1847, they had a daughter, Mary Maria. Unfortunately, my sister died in infancy. So when I was born, 6 years later, I was given her name, Mary. Not only that, I was expected to assume her age. They even went so far as to celebrate my birth on her birth date. So, as my father would have it, I turned 7 before I was 12 months old. This was all very confusing and hard to keep track of. Let me tell you, I know that this was the tradition at the time, but as somebody who had to live through it, it got old. It aged me. Now, I always thought when women lie about their age, they made themselves younger. My father made me older. This was very confusing and hard for me to do, and even some of the census records that were taken at the time didn't always show a 10-year progression in my age difference. Well, I was the oldest of the 5 living Head children. There were 4 girls and 1 boy. Life with father was unbearable at best. Father was very busy in law and politics, and tragically in 1863, when I was 10, or as my father would have it, 16, my mother passed away. What a blow. I missed my beloved mother. But at that point, I was expected to become the lady of the house. So as a 10-year-old, 16-year-old, I was now the lady of the house. I missed my beloved mother dearly, God rest her soul. But I rather enjoyed being in charge. So then in 1867, my father remarried. He married a woman named Mary S. Raymond. So we have a dead wife named Mary, a dead daughter named Mary, me named Mary, and a new wife named Mary. My father certainly was a creature of habit. I wonder if he thought he'd get all of our names confused. Well, anyway, now I had an evil stepmother. Think Disney movies. It's all true. So, life in my father's mansion was absolutely unbearable for me. So at age 14 and a half, and of course my father is telling people I'm 20 and a half, nearly 21, I decided that as an adult, I would leave home. So I went to St. Joseph, Missouri on a visit. We had some cousins down that way. I ran away from home. Well, my advanced age, my adult age, came in quite handy because while I was down in St. Joseph, I met a handsome 25-year-old man named Richard Jones Wells. Richard and his brother William worked at the railroad depot. Richard told the most fascinating stories about his life in the Civil War, where he would try to get, at personal risk, he would get messages to the Union troops. Richard and his brother joined the legitimate Overground Railroad to facilitate the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman used their land in Delaware to help the slaves from the South escape into Canada. Richard led a very adventurous and exciting life, and he loved adventure, just like I did. And evidently, I created excitement. There's never a dull moment between the two of us. I'm sure the whole neighborhood, and probably the entire town of Kenosha, could hear my father's loud protestations when I brought Richard home and we announced our engagement. Oh, my father was furious. Well, I stood up to him. After all, I was an adult. And I got my red hair and my stubbornness from Orson Sherman Head. So, in a very quiet ceremony in 1968, Richard and I were married in Kenosha, and then we moved back to St. Joseph, Missouri. I had my dowry, which was about $60,000. That's $1 million in today's monies. And we went back to St. Joseph, and we bought a suite of rooms at the Pacific House, which was a popular hotel in St. Joseph. Things were going along fine until one night we were awakened to the screams of fire. We ran to our window, and the fire brigade was tossing up ropes and ladders, and we narrowly escaped with just our lives. We lost all of our possessions. Undaunted, Richard and I rented a very big, nice house. We even had a servant named Matilda. She was from Australia. And a year later, we rented an even bigger and an even better house. Now, Father had always taught me the importance of managing money. And by 1871, Richard and I managed to go through my entire dowry. The $60,000 was gone. Well, things became even worse when Richard was demoted, and we had to go to the depressing little town of Saxton, Missouri, where Richard was now a freight agent. There was no decent housing. So we were put up in the freight building. Well, a small ray of light shone into our depressing existence when on November 12th, 1872, I gave birth to a 10-pound bouncing baby boy, Richard Hodgson Wells. I was 19 in real life, and I couldn't have been prouder. Well, unfortunately, not long after that happened, Richard was fired. So with no place else to go, we moved back to Kenosha and into my father's mansion with my father and my stepmother and my siblings that were still at home. Father was in very ill health at the time. Father never accepted Richard. He thought Richard was from the wrong side of the tracks. He never accepted Richard. And in Father's last will and testament, Father stipulated that I was not to get any of my inheritance until the death of, and I quote, her husband, unquote. Father also stipulated that I was to have guardians. I was an adult married woman with a child, and my father was stipulating that I needed guardians. The nerve. Well, when Father passed away of pneumonia in 1875, life in the mansion was intolerable. Richard was never accepted by Kenosha society. And in 1881, he fled the head mansion for the urban delights of Chicago. Our marriage survived paternal wrath, loss of property, fire, loss of employment, a new baby, but it could not survive living in my family's house. Richard showed no interest in keeping in touch with me or our son. And so in 1885, I had Richard declared dead. Who says I can't manage money? Then I got my inheritance. Incidentally, Richard did turn up alive and well about 14 years later in the state of New York, building and patenting furniture. Well, I didn't care. I had him declared dead. I was now free to pursue my own suitors. Near my father's mansion in Kenosha, there was a Danish man named Jacob Rudolph, and Jacob Rudolph Godfredson, and he ran and operated a brewery with his son, Frederick. Well, soon Frederick and I were married, and my family had a fit. No brewer was going to live in the mansion of Orson Head, so Frederick and I moved out, and we built our own fantastic home. Now, let me tell you about this house. And all of Kenosha was talking about it, and everybody wanted to see it. And it still exists today. It's this absolutely gorgeous, beautiful house. It's located on 711 61st Street. Do go by and look at it. You will want to see it. In the inside, we had imported mahogany at very great expense. And Frederick was a brewer. And so we had intricate hops, vines engraved in the mahogany woodwork. It's still there today. And on the third floor window on the outside of the stucco, there are beer bottles embedded in the facade. That is also still there today, and do go look at it. It's right across from the Masonic Temple. Well, it was about that time as well that Frederick and I welcomed our first son, Jacob Rudolph, and we named our house Rudolphsheim after our dear Rudy. Incidentally, our new house was right within sight of the head mansion, so when my uncles and cousins and siblings opened the drapes, they could see my new house. Everybody in Kenosha was talking about my new house and was dying to see it. So I decided, as a wealthy woman, taking my place back in society where I belong, I would hold society balls. So here's what I did. I had the guests enter through a very tiny, narrow staircase that was smaller than the servants' entrance and twice as dark. Now, to make this journey of 3 flights, I had my ballroom on the 3rd floor because that's where one's ballroom belongs. They had to double over and climb up these 3 steps to go through this journey. And once they got up to the top floor, I charged them a fee to get in. They had to give their ticket to this, there was a clerk agent in a very small little booth, and they had to give their ticket to this agent as if they were boarding a train. It's nice to see them so low as they tried to make me out to be. They had talked poorly about both of my husbands, Richard and Frederick. Frederick was never accepted either because he was a brewer. Oh, dear me. Well, we had our beautiful home and I had my parties. Now, let me tell you about my son, Richard. My son, Richard, had the devilishly handsome Wells good looks. He was also very creative and quite an inventor. He has 7 patents that you can still read about in the Library of Congress. Google it. Richard was a bit of a stage door Johnny. He liked ragtime music, the theater, and the moving pictures. He would hang out at the stage doors and he would wine and dine the buxom actresses after the show and take them out and fully living up to the Wells love of extravagance and the good life. When my son Richard was about 20 years old, he changed his name from Richard Hodgson Wells to Richard Head Wells in honor of the Head family. He also at that point added an E to the Wells surname. The name would now be spelled Wells, W-E-L-L-E-S. My husband and his family spelled it W-E-L-L-S. That's why there's a different spelling. My name is spelled differently than Georgie's. So when my son Dick was about 31 years old, he brought home 21-year-old Beatrice Ives. Oh, I thought she was a poor match for him. My Dick was worldly, well-traveled, and Beatrice was puritanical and conservative. She always had a cause she was going after. But Beatrice did manage to be the first woman elected to the school board. She served with that showy Mary D. Bradford, who was the superintendent at the time. Superintendent, by the way, an appointed position. My Beatrice was elected. Well, after Beatrice and Richard were married, they moved into Dick's home, which is right around the corner from mine. It was very convenient. Our yards touched. And in 1904, they presented me with my first grandson, Richard Ives Wells. Well, in 1913, my dear Frederick died, and I kept a lamp burning by his favorite chair in his memory. And in 1915, Richard and Beatrice presented me with my second grandson, George Orson Wells. He was named after my Uncle George and my father, Orson. It was almost prophetic that he was named after my father. You heard all about him last month. Yeah. Georgie, as I called him, was creative and inventive, just like his father and his grandfather. He also was a fantastic storyteller, like his father and his grandfather. He was also a strong presence, like my father, Orson Sherman Head. And he was also pig-headed and obstinate and sometimes hard to get along with. Nobody knows where that came from. Now, Georgie and I never really quite saw eye to eye. But as a grandmother, I was proud of him. And on a summer night in July 20th, 1942, I passed through the veil. And they put my sister's birth date on my headstone.
Did you catch the mistake I made before I introduced Viki?
Mistake?
I forgot to give a little bio on Viki.
Oh, don't worry about it. They just heard my bio.
Well,
I was born in Kenosha in
that's the bio
1853.
you're impersonating. But Viki performed and directed shows with the award-winning WGTD studio, radio theater rather, and she also reenacts historic Kenoshans in the dynamic performance with the History Walk that takes place at the